last video about this book. This is E.M. Adams' Ethical Naturalism and the Modern Worldview. So pretty much he kind of goes over classical naturalism, emotive naturalism, and logical naturalism. I talked about classical and emotive, and I want to talk about what he says is the logical naturalism. And it is very interesting because it's on the brink between being natural and not natural. This kind of form of ethics. This is what Adams calls a good reasons ethicist. This comes from Everett Hall and Toolman, and he gives a really good analysis of that. And he comes to this logical naturalism thing by saying that the classical version and the emotive version do not do. So he kind of sits with this logical position more than any of the others. Essentially, what does this mean? This means a good reasons ethicist or a naturalist. This means that ethical sentences only declare an ought or a ought not. So if we say that even if I just say that like X is good or X is right, there's a ought in there. When we say X is wrong, there's a ought not planted in there of what one ought or ought not do under certain circumstances. And this contrasts from the emotive version because in emotivism or emotive naturalism, when we say that a certain thing is emotive, it has to do with emotion as well as personal identity and like the character, pretty much. I would still class myself as a emotivist, and I would like to go through a big series of emotivism, going through the Ayer and Stevenson's texts, and doing that, following this naturalism series. Like I said, it's a response to emotive naturalism. It's specifying meaning specifying the meaning of ethical terms. So we're talking about validity. We're talking about validity conditions. We're talking about rationality and justification. So we have to. So why is this on the brink of being natural and not natural? It could be not natural because it could be. It could be somewhat not having to do with emotion, but there still could be validity conditions. But it's mostly natural. I would take the place that any logical naturalist framework is a naturalist position, because if we have validity conditions and conditions for meaning of terms, and because this is where we're basically talking about logic and language. There's not a whole lot of, not so much epistemology in this so much. It's more logical rationalization or logical rationality and validity conditions, and linguistic meaning, pretty much. An ethical statement is something as something else. It's basically saying that something or other is the thing to do, given circumstances, and not having to do with personal identity. So it's having like an objective thing too. So we have this here, and it's basically saying that it's called a good reasons good reasons ethics, pretty much. Why is it called a good reasons ethics? Interesting. A good reasons ethics is reacting to the emotivist contention about pure moral judgments are not subject to being reasoned about and appraised as valid or invalid. But its fundamental purpose is not to specify the meaning of ethical terms or sentences. He recognizes no particular problem about them. On ethical sentences simply declares that one ought or ought not, as the case may be, to do something or other, without regard to personal identity of those involved. So good reasons, good reasons. This really means just talking about validity and not so much specifying the meaning of the terms, but just that there's still some kind of meaning that's interwoven in here about the validity conditions. A ethical statement is subject to a rational proof or justification. So there's some little epistemology in here. So we have to justify our validity conditions, and we have to justify a rational proof given validity conditions. As to we have to have a proof, and we have to show how it's valid that a certain ethical sentence or moral judgment is reducible to a ought or ought not to do something, or ought not to do something or other. So a good reasons ethics is pretty much saying, well, we have ethical sentences and moral judgments, but they are reducible to a ought to do something or ought not to do something or other. But there's lots of logical and epistemological thought in here, because we have to have this very high standard of validity here to say that. Validity conditions, it's something that validates or invalidates a statement. Moral judgments are pretty much about a argument and rationality. A validity condition is pretty much saying that if we have something that will validate that a moral sentence is a ought or ought not. Now this should make one think about the ought is gap as to how a certain fact will lead one to a ought. Now Hume talks about this in my Oxford Handbook of Ethical Theory. The chapter in there by Sturgeon talks about this as well. So I'd like to have a video full on about that. So yeah, we have. Now I'm pretty much done with this book. This book, Adams goes through very, very detailedly all of this naturalist stuff. And I just wanted to kind of identify all the things that he goes over. Just kind of think about those things. But the name is Adams. It's a very, very good book to read on naturalism. If you want to understand ethical, if you want to understand it, I wouldn't recommend it so much. But if you want to kind of get really good arguments for and against various forms of naturalism, great one here. If you want to understand anything in ethics, I recommend the Oxford Handbook of Ethical Theory, as well as the Blackwell anthologies, and merely the anthology Virtue and Vices by Poyman, and the Ethical Theory one by Poyman, and the Moral Life by, I think also by Poyman. So, coffee. Okay, so I want to think about this a little bit more. First of all, what makes this natural? What makes this natural is the fact that we have logical and epistemological conditions for taking a ethical statement of terms like good and right and all this stuff, and we can kind of translate that into a ought or ought not. And we can't just do that. We can't just do this arbitrarily. We have to have, we have to have some kind of justification, epistemological and logical, as well as a rational proof as to how this little transition works. So we have and if we can do this, if we can have validity conditions and rational proofs and logical and epistemological justifications for as to how we're going to take a moral judgment or a ethical statement and bring that to a ought or ought not, then we do have a very naturalist framework, don't we? I mean, it's a very naturalist thing. If we can make this little connection, then we definitely have a naturalism. I personally think that this is the best case for naturalism. I think this kind of goes around Moore's naturalistic fallacy. It's because Moore said that if we're going to have a naturalist thing, we have to say goodness is reducible to what? Goodness as being reducible to some natural property. But we don't really have to do that. It kind of this little logical naturalism gets around that by saying, well, all we have to do is say what a certain ethical statement or moral judgment is saying that we ought to do. And we have various proofs and justifications and validity conditions as to how this little connection works. So this is the most stable thing, the most stable case for naturalism. Adams in this book goes very in depth into logical naturalism. In chapters following the one that I discussed, he talks about the cases for and against it. So yeah, this is just really awesome. This is personally my favorite thing. If I ever would be a naturalist, this would be how I would do it. But then we have that little problem, though, don't we, of personal identity as to how that kind of and emotion as to how that confers in moral judgments or ethical statements. But that's possible that through validity conditions and proofs and justifications, that we could kind of rule that blurring of the lines of emotion and personal identity and character out. But then it wouldn't really work with a virtue theory of normative ethics, would it? Thanks. Let me know your thoughts.